We may be very close to solving, with a high degree of certainty, the mystery of whose skeleton is actually attributed to Cleopatra's lineage. For centuries, it was believed to belong to Arsinoe, the queen's sister, a rebellious figure and also queen of Egypt. Cleopatra became known as one of the most beautiful women in history, but new genetic analyses and forensic reconstructions raise a disturbing hypothesis. The last pharaoh may have been a true biological time bomb. DNA data associated with her family reveal disturbing signs, suggesting that her greatest struggle may not have been against Rome, but against her own genetic heritage. To understand why the analysis of Cleopatra's DNA caused such a stir, it's necessary to go back to an investigation conducted as a criminal case. For over 2,000 years, the sands of Egypt have concealed the whereabouts of the last pharaoh's tomb, an enigma that has puzzled historians for generations. The most widely accepted version claims that her tomb is lost beneath modern-day Alexandria, destroyed by earthquakes and swallowed by the sea. Over the past 20 years, however, Kathleen Martinez has challenged this consensus. A criminal lawyer turned archaeologist, she treated Cleopatra's disappearance as an unsolved crime. Instead of following academic tradition, she profiled the suspect and followed overlooked clues. This led her about 50 kilometers west of Alexandria, to the ruined temple of Taposiris Magna. In 2022, the excavation revealed something extraordinary: a monumental tunnel carved directly into the rock, more than 1,300 meters long, about 180 meters high, and a line towards the Mediterranean. Submerged in mud and water, the structure is considered an engineering feat comparable to the famous Eupolinus tunnel in ancient Greece. Excavating so deeply into unstable rock would make no sense for an insignificant location. The work indicates strategic and symbolic importance. The discovery of a nearby submerged port reinforces the idea that the site was not an isolated temple, but an active center, part of a now submerged and little-known landscape of human history. For Martinez, the explanation is simple and grim. Cleopatra was not only preparing to die, but to disappear. She wanted to avoid the humiliation of being displayed as a trophy by Octavian, being buried next to Mark Antony, and immortalized as the incarnation of the goddess Isis, in a tomb impossible to desecrate. Other discoveries have made this hypothesis even more unsettling. In tombs excavated within the complex, archaeologists found mummies with gold amulets in place of their tongues. For the ancient Egyptians, these golden tongues allowed them to speak with Osiris in the afterlife, guaranteeing eloquence before the god of the underworld. Martinez believes that these dead were not random burials, but members of Cleopatra's inner circle, buried there to announce the queen's arrival. This suggests that the site is not just a cemetery, but a royal necropolis, a space prepared to receive her. Although the tomb has not yet been opened, the evidence already points to an obscure truth about her dynasty. And perhaps it won't be necessary to find Cleopatra's body to understand who she really was. The bones of her sister, whom she herself ordered executed, may be the final key to deciphering the genetic enigma of the last pharaoh, a blood rival. To understand the dead found in Taposiris Magna, we first need to understand the ruthlessness of the woman they served. History remembers Cleopatra as a seductress, but her family tree more closely resembled a tank of sharks, and his greatest threat wasn't a Roman general. It was his own younger sister, Arsinoe IV. That relationship was defined by pure, toxic ambition. When Cleopatra was exiled, it was Arsinoe who assumed the throne. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, it was Arsinoe who led the army against him. She was a warrior princess who, in fact, managed to corner Caesar inside the palace, but history is written by the victors. Arsinoe ended up being captured, dragged to Rome, and forced to march in chains during Caesar's triumphal parade. The Roman crowds even wept for her, a teenage girl in handcuffs. This commotion saved her life. She was exiled to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in present-day Turkey. She thought she was safe. She believed the sacred ground would protect her. She was wrong. In 41 BC, Cleopatra convinced Mark Antony to do the unthinkable. He sent assassins to the temple steps. They dragged Arsinoe outside and murdered her. It was a scandal that shook the ancient world. But for us, 2,000 years later, it provided a place. We knew exactly where the crime had occurred. For centuries, we believed Arsinoe was lost to history, until the early 20th century, when archaeologists in Ephesus found a unique tomb known as the Octagon. Inside, it was a skeleton. The bones belonged to a young person. For decades, if the theory were correct, these could be the remains of Arsinoe IV. The chronology matched, the location matched, the age matched too. If that skeleton was Arsinoe's, then we had Cleopatra's genetic code. We could finally answer questions about her ethnicity, her health, her lineage. We had the map of the Queen's biology. But science has a way of ruining a good story. Initial DNA tests failed due to contamination. The bones had been handled too many times. But recently, in a 2025 study, advanced analyses finally gave us an answer. And it wasn't what anyone expected. The African hypothesis. To understand why the 2025 results were so shocking, one must grasp the enormous weight this skeleton carried. It wasn't just about identifying a sister. It was about rewriting the very identity of the Queen. The controversy began with the tomb itself. The tomb is octagonal in shape. In the ancient world, this shape was a symbol. It alluded to Alexandria's most famous building, the Pharos Lighthouse. Archaeologist Hilke Thur connected the dots. She argued that an octagonal tomb in Ephesus, the very city where Arsinoe was murdered, could only belong to the exiled princess. The architecture was a fingerprint in stone that pointed directly to the royal family. But the theory didn't stop at architecture. It extended to biology. The original skull, found in 1929, had a chaotic history. It was lost in Germany during the bombing raids of World War II, and was only miraculously rediscovered in the archives of the University of Vienna in 2022. But before it disappeared, measurements and photographs had been taken. And based on these ancient records, Thur made an explosive revelation. She claimed that the skull measurements suggested the deceased person had an African mother. It was the spark that ignited a storm of controversy. If Arsinoe had an African mother and shared the same father as Cleopatra, then Cleopatra herself, often portrayed as purely Macedonian Greek, could be of mixed race. This idea has influential proponents. For decades, authors such as J.A. Rogers and Cheikh Anta Diop have argued that history has whitewashed Egypt. Pop culture, such as the 2023 Netflix docuseries, has brought this debate into millions of homes, casting a black actress to play the queen, strengthening the arguments for a black Cleopatra. Open the royal granaries. We must feed the people. And we must build a temple, a place of hope. The skeleton of Ephesus seemed to be the ultimate proof. It was the only physical evidence that challenged the prevailing consensus that the Ptolemies were an endogamous Greek dynasty. But the 2025 analysis didn't just change the sex of the skeleton. It completely dismantled the racial hypothesis, the cracked mirror. For years, this skeleton from Ephesus was our only mirror to Cleopatra's face. Scholars looked at those bones and saw the Queen's sister. They saw African heritage. They saw the answer to a centuries-old enigma. But recently, modern technology has cast a new light, and the mirror has shattered. The breakthrough came in 2022. A team from the University of Vienna, led by anthropologist Gerhard Weber, finally located the long-lost skull in the university's archives. It had been there, unnoticed, for decades. That changed everything. They didn't just look at the skull. They saw through it. Tomography scans. They created a high-resolution digital map of the bone structure. Then, they drilled into the petrous temporal bone, the densest part of the skull. A true biological vault that preserves DNA, even when the rest of the skeleton has already turned to dust. In January 2025, the results were published in Scientific Reports. And they revealed a medical horror story. The skeleton is not Arsinoe's, it's not from a 20-year-old woman. It's not from an African princess. DNA testing has proven the presence of a Y chromosome. Cleopatra's supposed sister was a boy, more specifically, a teenager between 11 and 14 years old. And he wasn't just young, he was seriously ill. The CT scans revealed severe developmental disorders. His jaw was atrophied. His skull was asymmetrical and deformed. Analysis suggests he suffered from something similar to Treacher-Collins syndrome or severe rickets. He wasn't a healthy, genuine rival. He was a child whose face had been shaped by a genetic tragedy. Even more shocking was the fact that his DNA revealed he wasn't from Egypt. His genetic markers point to Italy or Sardinia. This opens up an even darker and more confusing mystery. We thought we were facing the victim of a political assassination. Instead, we are facing a tragedy of another nature. The octagon has revealed itself to be a hero. A tomb built for a hero. A semi-divine figure. Why was a sickly and deformed Italian boy buried in one of the most prestigious tombs of the ancient world? Was he a scapegoat? A sacrifice? Or a hidden royal bastard? A son of Roman and Ptolemaic blood whose existence was so shameful or so dangerous that he needed to be buried with honors, but far from home? Whatever the answer, it became clear that the supposed scientific proof of Cleopatra's African lineage in this particular tomb was an illusion caused by flawed science and wishful thinking. So where does that leave us? Back to the historical record. And the record tells us that Cleopatra was a product of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And if you want to know what she really looked like, you don't need to find her body. Just look at the terrifying family tree she climbed to reach the throne. Because, although we don't have her DNA, we know exactly who her parents were. And that reality is far darker than any debate about skin color. The boy from Ephesus may have been a secret, but in Alexandria, the genetic nightmare was no secret at all. It was a real policy characterized by what is called pedigree collapse. In a typical family tree, the branches expand as you go up. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. The further back you go, the more ancestors there are. It's a funnel that opens up to the world. But Cleopatra's family tree didn't expand. It collapsed in on itself. The Ptolemies were a Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt. They wanted to maintain absolute power and a pure lineage. Therefore, they adopted the ancient pharaonic custom of incest. They didn't just marry cousins, but siblings as well. Historians believe that Cleopatra's own parents, Ptolemy V and Cleopatra V, were probably full siblings. Even her grandparents were possibly uncle and niece, or even brother and sister. This family was, evidently, a closed circuit. Geneticists estimate that Cleopatra was born with an inbreeding coefficient greater than 45%. For comparison, the child of 2 first cousins has a coefficient of around 6%. In many royal dynasties, such as the Habsburgs of Spain, this level of inbreeding led to severe deformities, infertility, and madness. One example is Charles II of Spain, a Habsburg king, whose autopsy recorded that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, a consequence of inbreeding. Historians call him the Bewitched. He was the end of the Habsburg line, a dynasty that practiced the same type of internal marriages as the Ptolemies. Charles was a medical tragedy. He couldn't speak until he was 4 years old. He couldn't walk until he was 8. His jaw was so deformed, a condition called mandibular prognathism, that his upper and lower teeth didn't touch. He literally couldn't chew his food. He swallowed everything whole. He had difficulty even with simple conversations, suffered from seizures, and was physically frail. When he died at age 38, the autopsy report stated that his body contained not a single drop of blood. Her head was filled with fluid, and her heart was the size of a peppercorn. Her inbreeding rate was about 25%. Cleopatra's was almost double that. Cleopatra exerts an enduring fascination because her story embodies power and beauty. So why is that? The scientific explanation involves something called homozygosity. Normally, DNA is a dialogue between mother and father. One compensates for the other's shortcomings. If the mother transmits a recessive gene for a weakness or disease, the father usually transmits a healthy dominant gene to neutralize it. It's a biological safety net. But in Cleopatra's case, there was no dialogue at all. It was the same genes repeating the same mistakes, over and over again. Since her parents were siblings, they carried exactly the same genetic flaws. There wasn't a healthy gene to intervene and save her. Biologically, she should have been a disaster. That level of inbreeding usually results in the deformities we saw in that boy from Ephesus. Physical weakness, cognitive impairment, short lives. But here's the terrifying paradox. History tells us that Cleopatra was not deformed. She was brilliant. She spoke 9 languages. She charmed the most powerful men in Rome. She commanded armies. So how was that possible? Was she a genetic miracle? An improbable twist of biological dice? Or have we always ignored the signs of her suffering? To understand if she was a victim, we need to look at those responsible, her ancestors. If you want to know what Cleopatra was fighting against, Look at her great-uncle, Ptolemy VIII. He was Cleopatra's great-uncle, but because of the incestuous family tree, he also served as a direct genetic mirror. He was a medical catastrophe. He was called Physcon, a term that translates to big belly, and that was being kind. Historical records describe him as morbidly obese, with limbs too weak to support his massive body. He needed to be carried by helpers to be able to walk. He wore thin, transparent tunics that horrified Roman visitors. But look more closely at the descriptions. It wasn't just fat. The sources mention a swollen neck, bulging eyes, and difficulty breathing. Now look at Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy VIII, the flute player. He was described as indulgent, weak, and physically flabby. These are not merely character flaws. These are symptoms. Modern medical historians, when analyzing the Ptolemaic dynasty, see a pattern of genetic metabolic disorders. They see evidence of fibrotic conditions affecting multiple organs. They see a family lineage plagued by obesity and lethargy. And, even more terrifying, they see the markers of Graves' disease, an autoimmune disorder that attacks the thyroid. It causes exophthalmos, bulging eyes, and goiter, swelling of the neck. And this is where the diagnosis becomes frightening. Graves' disease doesn't just affect appearance, it affects behavior. It floods the body with thyroid hormones, creating a state of hyperstimulation. Symptoms include manic energy, rapid speech, insomnia, and erratic, high-risk behavior. Does this sound familiar? Historians have always extolled Cleopatra's inexhaustible vitality. They say she worked all night, that she was always on the move. We frame that as genius. But medical anthropologists are now asking a darker question. Was Cleopatra's legendary energy actually a symptom? Was the fire within her the result of a genetic thyroid storm inherited from her uncle? Cleopatra was never as self-assured as she seemed to be. Let's look at the physical evidence we actually have, starting with the coins. When we analyze the silver tetradrachms minted during her reign, we see the familiar traits manifesting themselves. Cleopatra has a Ptolemaic nose, strong, curved, aquiline. She has a prominent and projecting chin. She has a thick neck. These are not the features of a delicate queen. They are the features of a survivor. But, beneath the surface, the genetic bomb was armed. The Ptolemaic lineage was plagued by fibrodystrophy and bone density problems. In highly inbred populations, the skeletal structure often weakens. The jaw becomes deformed, exactly as we saw in the boy from Ephesus. And what about a predisposition to obesity? Ptolemy VIII had the famous protruding belly. Did Cleopatra inherit that gene? Some experts speculate that her famously short stature wasn't natural. It was a result of war. If she had the genetic predisposition for the morbid obesity that incapacitated her uncle, her life would have been a constant battle against her own metabolism. Her slender body may have been the result of hyperthyroidism, burning calories at a dangerous rate. So how did she escape? That is the great debate between the medical victim theory and the genetic miracle theory. The first theory argues that Cleopatra was a victim of Ptolemaic inbreeding. It states that she did not escape it. It suggests that, although she avoided visible deformities, she did not escape the cost. And the evidence for this comes from an unlikely source: the ancient historian Plutarch. Plutarch never used terms like stunted growth, but he left two specific clues that medical anthropologists have recently connected. The first is the famous carpet scene. Hollywood depicts Cleopatra unfurling from a Persian carpet, but Plutarch writes that she got into a sleeping bag, basically a linen sack for clothes, was tied up, and carried on the back of a single servant, Apollodorus. Think about the physics of that. Being placed in a sack and carried like a backpack implies that she was extremely light. She wasn't an imposing Amazon. She was small. The second clue is even more direct. Plutarch explicitly criticizes his appearance. In Life of Antony, he writes that his beauty, in itself, was not so remarkable. He insists that his power came from his voice and his character, not from his body. When these long-standing clues are overlaid with an inbreeding coefficient of 45%, small begins to look a lot like growth restriction. This theory suggests that her short stature was not just a physical trait, it was a symptom. She proposes that Cleopatra was physically frail, perhaps struggling against a body that was trying to fail, and that she used her intellect to compensate for her lack of physical prowess. The second theory goes in the opposite direction and is even more perplexing. In genetics, there's the concept of rolling the dice. Even with an inbreeding coefficient of 45%, it's statistically possible, though rare, to inherit healthy genes. Let's consider the probabilities. Cleopatra's siblings were weak. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, was a childish puppet who drowned in the Nile. Her sister, Arsinoe, was captured and killed. The boy from Ephesus, a possible link to Cleopatra, was deformed. And yet, Cleopatra lived to be 39 years old. She had 4 children, proving that she was fertile, something that is usually the first thing to disappear in inbred lineages. She commanded a naval fleet in battle. She may have been a Mosaic survivor. While her family tree collapsed, she walked through the fire unscathed. He inherited the intellect of the Greeks and the strategic ruthlessness of the Romans. But he escaped the metabolic collapse of the protruding belly and the facial deformities of the boy in Turkey. In the 1920s, archaeologists were exploring a tomb here, in the heart of Ephesus. But we must remember, biology always exacts its due. Even without deformities, she carried the burden. The manic energy, the taking of extreme risks, the paranoia. These may not have been personality traits. They may have been psychological echoes of a brain shaped by centuries of incest. But here arises an even darker speculation. Whether she was a miracle or a sufferer, Cleopatra knew something was wrong. She grew up watching her family deteriorate. She understood the pattern, and this completely changes how we view her life. Historians often say that Cleopatra seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony for political power. They say she wanted the armies of Rome, but what if she wanted something more valuable? What if she was searching for new DNA? Think about it. Cleopatra was married to her brother Ptolemy X, then to her other brother Ptolemy XIV. According to tradition, she should have had children with them, but she refused. She had no children with her brothers. Instead, she turned to Rome, to Caesar, a man with no relation to her, then to Antony. What if she wasn't just building an alliance? What if she was carrying out a biological rescue mission? She knew her bloodline was collapsing. She knew that one more generation of incest would produce monsters. Children like the boy from the octagonal tomb. She was trying to save her children from the genetic spiral that created her. She was desperately trying to widen the funnel back into a tree. The pharmacologist queen. If we accept the theory that Cleopatra was a medical victim, suffering from joint pain from inbreeding or from the manic tremors of Graves's disease, an impossible question arises. How did she function? How does one command an army when their bones ache or their thyroid makes their heart race? The answer may lie in a skill that historians often overlook. She wasn't just a queen, she was a chemist. Everyone knows the famous story of the pearl. To win a bet against Mark Antony about who could offer the most expensive dinner, she supposedly took a priceless pearl, dropped it into a cup of vinegar, waited for it to dissolve, and drank the contents. The story portrays this as a gesture of decadence. But look at it with the eyes of a scientist. That's a chemical reaction. Calcium carbonate reacting with acetic acid. She understood the properties of matter. And if she understood how to manipulate pearls, she certainly understood how to manipulate plants. If she lived with the chronic pain of pedigree collapse, the same kind of joint and bone suffering that plagued the Habsburgs, it is likely that she resorted to the royal pharmacy. Egypt was the pharmaceutical capital of the ancient world. If you were in pain, you had access to opium, extracted from the poppy fields of Thebes. It was the ultimate painkiller of antiquity. She used it to numb the pain in genetically compromised joints, just to be able to remain upright during endless diplomatic receptions. If you suffered from the mania and insomnia of Graves' disease, you might have resorted to kafai. This was a complex incense from temples, often burned at night, known for its sedative properties. Plutarch wrote that its aroma induced sleep and loosened daily tension like a knot being undone. For a woman possibly trembling with the energy of hyperthyroidism, kafai would be more than just a perfume. It would be a remedy. And then there's the blue lotus, a mildly psychoactive flower, often macerated in wine. She produces a feeling of euphoria, an impression of floating. We talk so much about Cleopatra's legendary charisma, how she managed to bewitch men with her presence. But was this charisma natural? Or was it chemically induced? Was her energetic and captivating magnetism, in fact, a delicate cocktail of blue lotus wine and adrenaline, keeping her above the pain of her own body? And finally, consider her face. We know that Cleopatra wrote a book on cosmetics called Cosmeticon. Fragments of the work were cited by later physicians, such as Galen. This shows that she didn't just buy makeup. She studied it. Why? If the gene for the protruding belly caused her skin problems, or if Graves' disease caused a goiter, her obsession with cosmetics wasn't vanity. It was camouflage. She may have resorted to charcoal to redesign overly prominent eyes, created wide necklaces and elaborate jewelry to disguise a swollen neck, and developed ointments to soothe skin affected by metabolic disorders. All indications are that Cleopatra used science, botany, and aesthetics as tools for survival. Perhaps she was the first biohacker in history, an extraordinary mind trapped in a collapsing body, carefully projecting the image of a living goddess while, away from the public eye, treating herself as a chronically ill patient. If she spent years painting an idealized version of her own face, she won at least one war, that of legacy, by ensuring that only the goddess would be remembered, and not the monster she feared existed beneath the surface. Now, however, about 12 meters below the Mediterranean seabed, Kathleen Martinez is about to do exactly what Cleopatra feared most: remove that painting. The tomb awaits. This brings us back to the Temple of Taposiris Magna, where Martinez has been excavating for 2 decades in search of the Queen's final resting place. Thanks to the colossal tunnel, the so-called geometric miracle, she is closer than anyone has ever been. But the meaning of this discovery has changed. Initially, the search was for a legend, the seductress who enchanted Rome, the beauty immortalized by cinema, Isis incarnate. Science, however, suggests that we should prepare for another revelation. If Martinez breaks through the final barrier and finds the sarcophagus, he will not only be uncovering a queen, but a medical archive. A short, frail woman may emerge, concealing deep pain beneath a carefully constructed mask. Someone less like a movie star and more like a survivor, who confronted Rome with intelligence while battling her own DNA with her personal pharmacy. Finding Cleopatra will not only rewrite the political history of the ancient world, but also its biology. It will ultimately answer whether she was a genetic miracle who escaped a dynastic curse, or a ruler who suffered in silence while defying all odds. For now, the tunnel remains silent. The DNA sequencers await, and the ghost of the last pharaoh still guards its secrets. But one thing is already clear. Cleopatra's reality is far more complex and far more disturbing than the myth we have come to admire. Perhaps that is exactly what she wanted. The question that remains is simple and unsettling. If the tomb is open tomorrow, which Cleopatra will emerge? The genetic miracle or the medical victim who ruled despite everything?